Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here in person. And thank you to everybody who watches the live stream around the world. I know that some people are tuning in from a variety of countries, and that's actually very symbolic and exciting because today I'm going to talk about the power of visual storytelling, which transcends geographic and linguistic barriers. Visual storytelling is the connective tissue that binds us all as human species. And so it's so wonderful that we have people who are here present in person and people who watch us all around the world, so welcome. I want to talk to you about visual storytelling as a language in particular. And the reason for that is because it has rules and it's made out of building blocks like every language, and we're going to go through these building blocks one by one. Some of these blocks are very fundamental, meaning that people all over the world can understand them, and they're kind of our common ground biologically. Some of these are more specific to different cultures, and they're more complicated, things like visual metaphors and things like that are culture specific. So we're going to go into that as well. A few brief words why I'm talking to you about that and why it's interesting to me. So as Paul said, I am a visual artist. My profession is designing sets and costumes for stage and film. I don't actually like these terms so much, so I will correct myself right away and to say, instead of scenery, I will say environments, and instead of costumes, I'll say characters. And the reason for that is because what I do doesn't merely show beautiful visuals. It actually tells a story. I tell stories with the visuals that I create. And so when I create scenery for a play or a TV show, a film, I actually create an environment that tells a story about particular events. And when I create costumes for fictional characters, I actually communicate their characteristics to the audience so that when someone comes on stage, you're able to tell a lot about them before they ever open their mouth, right? And so I've been very lucky throughout my career to work around the world. So I designed productions and films in dozens of cities in many countries for global audiences. And throughout my work, I couldn't help but notice that very different audiences respond very similarly to very particular visual clues. And so I started to get very interested in that, started investigating that, started reading that. And that's when I learned that because we share a very common biology, right? No matter where we are, our eyes are structured in the same way. Our brains are structured in the same way. No matter if we live in Africa, in Ukraine, in America, it doesn't matter. We all share the same biology. Certain visual clues affect us in the same way, right? So that's what I call the fundamental building blocks of visual storytelling. So that's why it's interesting to me, because I have to communicate to audiences everywhere and tell them a variety of stories through visual art. Why I think it's relevant to you and to audiences worldwide is because currently, especially today in our modern age, we're bombarded with visuals every single day. Through our phones, computers, TV screens, advertising banners on the sides of the road, etc., etc. And everyone is competing for our attention, right? Some of these visuals are meant for benevolent purposes. Some of these visuals are meant for malevolent purposes. And it's very important that we understand what is being communicated to us and how, and what is targeting our amygdala, right? It's in the back of our head, that thingy that tells us to be afraid, that triggers the fight and flight response before we even understand it. There are visuals that do that. And what actually talks to our prefrontal cortex, which is here, which is actually our reasoning, our understanding, etc., right? So it's very important for us as the people who receive visual communication to understand what is being communicated to us and why, and what tools are being used on us, right? And it's also important for us to understand how to better communicate to others in our age of division. Visual storytelling is a great way to bring people together We need to learn how to better communicate with each other. That's the only way forward. We all know that. And so if we know how to better communicate, we're going to be able to build bridges and create a better world. So without further ado, let's get into it. I want to show you images that were put together by a fantastic writer. Her name is Ingrid Fattel Lee. She wrote a wonderful book. It's called Joyful. I highly recommend reading it. And it's about visuals that cause us joy and why, and visuals that don't cause us joy and why. So I wanted to ask just briefly if you could tell me, how do these images make you feel when you look at them? Happy? What other emotions come up? Happy, what else?
Expectant.
Yeah, expectant, what else? Playful. Excited, right? Fantastic. Now how about these images? How do they make you feel? Cold, stressed, suspicious, depressed, corporate. So let me start decoding that for you, and then we will come back to them and you will understand why you feel this way. So, as I said, building blocks of visual language, right? They go from fundamental to complex, and so we're going to cover a lot of territory today, so hang with me. It's a lot. I can teach this for the entire year, but I've compressed it into an hour, so let's go. So color, obviously the most basic one, right? It's the most basic tool, very complex subject, but I'm only going to touch on 4 particular things that are relevant to our conversation today. So color, it profoundly influences our brain, right? It's one of the most fundamental blocks of visual storytelling. So it actually affects memory and attention. So it's been proven through scientific research that color enhances memory retention and recall. And people tend to remember things that are brighter and more contrasty. They tend to remember those better than things that are muted or faded or presented to them in black and white. Also, emotional response. We all know that different colors can make us feel different ways. Again, it's been scientifically proven that, for example, warm colors make us feel excited. They make us feel maybe more energetic, while the cooler colors like blues and greens make us feel calm and relaxed. There are also physiological responses, right? So what we were talking about, the amygdala, for example, it has been proven that the color red makes our pulse go faster. More blood is being pumped into our bodies, right? Again, it can make us excited, but it also can make us feel stressed. So red is not necessarily a bad color. Red is a wonderful color, but when used in certain contexts, it can be used to scare us because biologically all it does, it pumps our adrenaline up. It makes our heart beat faster, right? So it's a physiological response. We also know that colors like blue and green, they actually lower our blood pressure. Physically, they do that. And so, of course, due to everything that I just mentioned and a myriad of other very specific reasons, colors actually affect decision making. And advertisers know that, people who do political propaganda know that. And that's why you can see that certain colors are used in different advertising campaigns, and they're used to convince us to do certain things, right? It's a certain manipulation. Again, this manipulation can happen for good purposes or bad purposes, but just know that it's happening. And when you know the tools, you will be able to decode it. So as I just said, very simple, right? You know that the warm colors are there on the left. That's all the colors that are considered warm. Underneath them, all the colors that are considered calming and cool. And then we also have the entire color wheel that can be bright or muted. So let me just show you a few real-world examples of how it's being used. So for example, you know comic books, right? Comic books are made to excite us, to give us a sense of adventure, and keep us on the edge of our seats, so to speak. So if you see here, the colors are very bright and they're very contrasting. right? There are certain colors that when you put them next to each other actually amplify each other, make themselves look even brighter than they are in real life. And so here on the right, you notice that the action hero that is very active wears red, and the one that is slumped over is in blue. Because also warm colors are typically active colors, cool colors are typically passive colors. And so you can even see that even though all of these images are very, very busy and very bright and exciting, the person who is surrendered or captured is rendered in blue. These are muted colors. Okay, some of you may know this very famous painting. It's called Monk by the Sea by Caspar David Friedrich. And this painting really is meant to make us contemplate, make us think, make us pray. And as you can see, it's very, very muted. It's not there to excite. It's there to evoke contemplation. And if you really notice, there is a monk there who is standing on the very edge of the beach, almost blending with the waters. So the human becomes one with nature. When they pause, breathe, contemplate, that's why you see that in this painting there is just no bright colors. There is no sharp edges. It all is made to bring us into a meditative state. So what happens when you connect the two? What happens if you take muted colors and a bright color and you direct someone's focus to a particular place? Then you start telling a very complicated story. We're starting layering these building blocks of visual storytelling. So here you can see it's the Georgia Department of Corrections. People are incarcerated there, and you can see that the entire interior is very cold, very geometric, and very monotonous. Nothing stands out. The only thing that stands out is the door. And what color did they paint it? Yellow. There is many symbols to that. It can be hope of getting out. It can be danger to make sure that no one gets out. It means different things to the prisoners and the guards, right? So for the guards, that's the focal points that draws their eye. So they see if someone tries to escape, they see them immediately because they're not blending with a monotonous environment. But for the inmates is that glimmer of hope, knowing that one day they can get out. One day they can walk through that door. And for them, the symbol of yellow is hope. For others, the symbol of yellow can be danger, right? So we assign meaning to these colors, but whenever we combine them, it creates a third meaning that is created from the first two together. So the next fundamental building block is shape. Talking again about our commonalities as human beings, because we all share a past of not living in cities and hunting and harvesting to sustain ourselves. We all know that round shapes are not dangerous, right? We know that round shapes are safe. Generally, if we see a soft, smooth rock, we know we can sit on it, it will be fine. Whenever we see a really sharp shape, we know it's dangerous potentially, we can cut ourselves. And so we have this revulsion, we know we should probably be careful, right? It's an instinctive response that we all share around the globe, no matter where we are. So just to demonstrate and layer these together, even though both of these objects are green, we have an immediate understanding. In a split second, our brain knows one is safe, one is not safe because of the shape, okay? Not because of the color, so we're layering the building blocks here. Patterns are another fascinating thing. When we were harvesting, we knew that if we found a lot of colorful fruits, were we going to eat that day? And maybe we were even going to eat next day. So we learned that if we see a lot of colorful, bright things, it's a good thing. It's a good thing for our health, for our sustenance. In comparison, we knew that if we found two tiny little wilted pieces of fruit, we're not going to eat today or tomorrow. That's a bad thing. Again, our common understanding is a lot of colorful, bright things is a good thing. Now think about it. In many different countries, we have fireworks. In many different countries, we have confetti. In many different countries, people love colorful sprinkles on their ice cream. I don't know a country where people don't love that. These people all share this in common. This is a biological undercurrent that we all humans share. In comparison to that, Straight, monotonous lines are just not in nature. You know, you don't have that many straight, equal lines. So our brains are not tuned to this. We don't tend to process it as well. And so when we translate it into the regular life that we all live right now, if you had a friend living in a building on the left, well, you wouldn't be able to tell where they live. You can't remember it because every unit looks exactly the same. It's a monotonous visual, and we cannot, as humans, make a story about it. You know, we don't know who lives there. In comparison to that, this is a beautiful street in Venice on Burano Island, and there every family gets to paint their house however they want. And if you had a friend living in that one of those houses, you would remember where they live, and you could probably tell a story about them, and you could tell a lot about their character depending on how they decided to paint their house, right? And so this is a bit of pattern as visual rhythm, also a very important building block of visual storytelling. And the last one is composition, right? So there is static composition, and then there is dynamic composition. Just like with other things that we were talking about, none of these things individually are good or bad. We assign that meaning to those concepts. So a static composition, it can be both safe, but it can also be boring, right? Dynamic composition is very exciting, but it can also be dangerous, right? So here we feel like kind of all these things are sliding down, about to fall off the page. Well, we're more engaged with that story because something is happening there. We're not maybe so engaged with the story up above because nothing is happening there. So again, if you want to excite your audience, it might be better to create a dynamic composition to keep them engaged. So if you see, for example, these two images, on the right it's static composition, not much to tell there. Top and bottom are equal. It's a calm day, beautiful calm day, end of story. On the left you can see a dynamic composition. I'm sure a lot of you know about Sisyphus and his story of rolling a boulder up the mountain. This is a meditation on that myth by a photographer whose name is Misha Gordon. And when we're looking at that, we see that this human is rolling this giant boulder up the mountain, but there are so many there already. And there will be another one, and another one, and another one. And so there is a story there, and we can begin to think about it. What is it like for that person? We can begin to empathize with that person. We can begin to develop emotions in relation to that image, versus it's very hard to develop complex emotions to the image on the right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I use it in my work. This is an image from a production that my creative partner, David Adamore, that some of you may have heard from yesterday, and I created for an opera called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It's based on Oliver Sacks' book. He was a really famous neurologist, and he wrote a book about this opera singer who suffered from a condition that's called visual agnosia, meaning that he couldn't tell what is the meaning of shapes. So when he saw squares and circles, he didn't know what they are. But because he was such a skilled musician, he could understand if he assigned music to shapes, he could understand what the shapes are. So he made a breakfast song, a dressing up song, a walking on the street song. So when he sang the breakfast song, he realized that the circles in front of him are a cup of coffee and a saucer. And it's music that connected the dots for him. So David and I wanted to create a set that as soon as it appeared on stage, immediately translated that very complex condition to people who watch the show. And so you can see the entire environment around the piano, where music is hyper-realistic, very colorful. It's his living room that we can all recognize and understand. But the further you get away from the piano, the more we lose sense of what's happening. The color is draining, the shapes are becoming complex, they become very geometric, they lose their meaning, and by the time you get to the upper left corner, well, they just fly into the ether and disappear completely. So the further he goes away from his piano, the further away he is from the music, the further away he is from meaning, right? So this is an example of a visual picture that immediately shows you a very complex condition that the human is experiencing, and then the entire story is taking place there. And so we used color, composition, pattern, texture to tell that story. And so if I'm going to bring back to the image that I just showed you a few minutes ago, so what do you think all these images have in common that made you feel joyous and happy? Bright colors. What else? Round shapes. A multitude of round shapes, right? It's the abundance. So abundance makes us feel happy. Round shapes, bright colors, and levity. For some reason, humans respond really well to levity. That's why we have hot air balloons. I think everybody around the globe can agree that these are cool. Fireworks and things like that, right? We love levity, and especially if bright colors are in the sky, even better. That's why we love rainbows. Curved, colorful, high up. How about these? What are these? What do these have in common? Angular, straight lines. Muted, drab colors. Very static. And then you ask yourself, why does our life look like this and not like this? Why do our offices and hospitals and hospices and kindergartens look more like this than like this?
Easy to clean.
That's very true, but does it make you happy? It does not. It's the pragmatism. You're very right. Someone says it's easy to clean. Yes, it's easy to clean and it's cheap to build. Straight lines, cheap to build in the factory, right? But unfortunately, it comes at a cost of human happiness. But we can change it now that we know that. So you be the change, and I will be the change. So humans have expressed themselves through visuals for tens of thousands of years, really, and we use it for a variety of causes. I'm just briefly going to talk about four main ones. It's to educate, persuade, entertain, and inspire, right? These are the four main kind of categories that we use visuals for. So to educate, to pass knowledge generation to generation, we needed to teach how to hunt, right? Because that was sustenance. And it's not surprising that the earliest known evidence of storytelling, visual storytelling, is from almost 44,000 years ago. And it's in a cave on an island in Indonesia, and it's depicting a hunting scene. And it is meant to educate the next generations how to hunt. These images surpass the natural lifespan of the hunters, right? And so people of younger generations can come and learn and learn and learn. Animals were also depicted as a source of wonder, as spiritual beings, as wisdom, right? This is another image from 24,000 years later. This image is in France, in Lascaux cave. And there are many, many giant animals painted on these caves in the most beautiful depictions. And these are probably meant, we don't know what they are there for, of course. We can also imagine, only imagine that they're there to inspire and educate and transmit knowledge. We also, of course, educate our generations about culture. Song and dance have been depicted visually for tens of thousands of years, just to pass the ritual of dance, of prayer, of aesthetics. This is from present-day Luxor in Egypt. You can see it's a banquet scene where we can see people dancing, we can see people playing musical instruments, and it's just phenomenal that we can see today and get a window into that reality of what was it like for these people then to sing, to dance, to dress in the kind of clothes that they had. And then, of course, visuals are fantastic to transmit fantasy and myth, fables, right? Because they're full of imagination. Some of you may know these images that I'm showing now. It's the unicorn tapestries that were designed in Paris and produced in Brussels or Liège in the 15th century. If some of you are coming by New York, it's actually in the cloister museums, in the cloisters in New York. Highly recommend seeing those in person. They're absolutely wondrous. And so here, this is done through tapestry, through embroidery, and it's there to pass the myth the fable of the unicorns from generations to generations. And when you're there at the Cloisters Museum and you're standing in front of this enormous tapestry, it's more than life-size, just to see these wondrous creatures and to think that people in the 1500s told these fables to each other, and now we're able to stand 5 feet away and connect to that visual and to that story. It's pretty magical. We used visuals to glorify warfare. This is an image of a very famous painting by Paolo Uccello, The Battle of San Romano, also from 1500s. And there were, of course, millions of other images that glorify warfare. And you can see it's saturated in color, very complex composition, very exciting, very bright. And it's there to tell people about the glory of these soldiers and the amazing things that they have achieved. In contrast, there are images that are explicitly anti-war. This is a very famous painting by Pablo Picasso that was made in 1937. In response to the first aerial saturated bombing of a civilian population in Spain. This has never been done before, when an entire population has been absolutely obliterated by aerial bombings. And when Pablo Picasso created this painting, he wanted no color in it. The image is actually in black and white. It's not just a black and white photograph. And as you can see, all the figures are completely disfigured and mutilated. So here he used the style that is called Cubism to portray it, but in fact, the reason why he used it, because Pablo Picasso could paint in every style. Of course, you know that from hyperrealism to complete abstract. But here he chose to use Cubism because the mutilation that happened was unimaginable. And this is the most famous anti-war, enormous painting, just as enormous as the unicorn tapestries. But it is an anti-war protest, and here he specifically drained it of color and used very sharp edges here. If you see again, round shapes, sharp shapes, right? It is meant to dissuade us from waging war, right? And so it's a very powerful statement. So we used visual storytelling to communicate fables, right? So in Japan, for example, there is this storytelling device called kamishibai, and a person would walk in the villages with this contraption, and it's been practiced since Middle Ages until the 1940s. And it's kind of like a frame, and he would slide paintings in and out of that frame, like a slide projector, like a manual slide projector, and tell stories about it. And so, interesting fact is that a couple of years ago, I designed the world premiere of an opera about Steve Jobs. It's called The Revolution of Steve Jobs, and I designed scenery for it. It premiered in Santa Fe Opera and then went all over the United States, and it's going to be premiering in Finland in 2026. And Steve Jobs was really inspired by Japanese culture. Him and his family went to Japan almost every year. And so the minimalist aesthetic of all the Apple products is inspired by Japanese storytelling. And you can't help but think, did he know about this mode of very traditional Japanese storytelling? Because the sliding of the screens in our smartphones, Apple phones were the first ones to do it, if you remember. It's the exact same idea, that you slide it from side to side and you see different visuals. Just like in the Japanese kamishibai tradition, they would slide these images from side to side and tell these stories. So it's very interesting. Of course, one of the biggest things that thrusted civilization into a completely different level of development was writing. And what is that really? It's taking articulated ideas that before we could only verbally to communicate to our closest tribe, encode them with visual codes. Sometimes it would be something like this, like cuneiform. Sometimes it would be hieroglyphs, right? Sometimes it would be actual writing in different languages. And then you could pass it to other cities and other towns and send it to other countries, right? Because before, civilization was in small bands, right? You could communicate to about 100 people, you could know about 100 people, but as our tribe started getting bigger and our communities started to get bigger, our cities started to get bigger, it's very hard to verbally tell everybody, you know, what the ordinance is, or when is the national holiday. How would you verbally tell that to 1,000 people? 10,000 people, right? That's when writing comes in place. And once writing became possible, once we started being able to encode our ideas in visuals that could be then physically taken somewhere else, that's what enabled us to create bigger villages, bigger cities, and then bigger countries. And what helped with that even more? Of course, it's the inventing of the printing press. Because before, if you think about it, scribes would sit there and write on the papyrus or, you know, work on the cuneiform clay tablets. Well, how many could they produce? They produced, of course, how many? Once printed press was invented, it was a completely different story because all of a sudden you could print the Bible, you could print the paintings, you could print the books, and you could send thousands, tens of thousands, and then, of course, with modern technology, hundreds of millions of visually encoded ideas all around the world. Interesting fact is that for the, when the first Bible was printed, it was still embellished by hand, because they wanted it to look handmade, even though it was printed. And so whoever paid more for the Bible, it was more embellished for them. But that's just how it was. In the beginning, just in order for that not to look too jarring from what it used to be, it was still hand-painted. But printing press really enabled our modern civilization today. And so talk a little bit about persuasion. So persuasion really divides into two big camps. One is advertising, another is propaganda. Pretty much similar, but slightly different, right? So on the right here, you can see Rosie the Riveter. You all know this image. The reason for this image is to persuade women to go into the workforce during World War II. It was extremely effective. And in order to do that quickly, very few colors were used. Our eye is drawn to her face because she has a red handkerchief on her head, and it's just one slogan. You can do it, we can do it. And so it's very easy to remember, and the gesture shows independence, force, strength, brilliant, right? And I think about 43% more of women went into the workforce thanks to this advertisement. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's about there. Very different on the left. On the left, it's a propaganda image from 1968 from China. This is Mao, right? And what does it do? It actually shows him as the sun. It's important to remember that at that time there were many illiterate people still in the land of China, and you needed to communicate in such a way that everybody will understand. What does everybody understand? The sun. Everybody understands sun is a good thing. Sun gives us light, sun gives us sustenance, strength, warmth. So they put Mao as the sun. And his face is much bigger than everybody else's face. And so again, immediately, even if you can't read, when you look at it, you see that Mao is good, Mao is supernatural, and Mao is above us all, right? It's encoded in the visual. This is another positive propaganda from Soviet Union from 1924. Speaking of illiterate population, very important to remember that before the revolution of 1917, the vast majority of the Russian Empire was illiterate. So after the revolution, there was a big push to make as many people as possible literate. And so there was this positive propaganda used that tried to convince people to learn how to read. And so here it says книги, books. And she's saying books, and books по всем отраслям знания, which means on all the subject of knowledge, right? And you can see that the woman is in black and white, and she looks like a peasant with a peasant handkerchief, a very recognizable image to people of that time of a person who is not from the city. not a bookish person. So they see that the person who is presumably illiterate from the villages is in black and white, but the entirety of the rest of the image is very colorful and dynamic, meaning that if you know how to read, your life will become very exciting. Ideas will open up to you, right? And so again, even if you don't read, but you look into that image, you will immediately understand that something exciting is going to be happening, and the word that spells knigi, books, is the simplest one and the biggest one. So if you knew the alphabet, you could read that word. So brilliant advertising sometimes need to break the rules, right? So, you need to know the rules so that you can break the rules. So in the 1950s, the vast majority of cars were advertised like this. Okay, this is very common, lots of color, big cars, lots of text, very busy, very exciting. Well, Volkswagen needed to advertise their car and didn't have the best reputation. World War II happened, They needed to do something very radical. They knew that they couldn't do the same as the rest of the cars do. And so they decided to come out with a radically different advertising campaign for Volkswagen. And it was called Think Small. And it was revolutionary at that time. It was done in 1959, exactly in the same year when these came out, same year. So what they did is they're the first one to use the sans serif font. You see, it's a very simple font. It looks very modern, but it was done that in 1959. The image of the car is not in the center. It's offset. So if we go back to the dynamic composition that I was talking about a while back, it's exciting. It's like, oh, what's happening? Where is the car? Oh, it's over there. It's very small. Our eye goes to the car, up, right? And finally, the ad was printed in black and white when everything else was color. You have to remember that Technicolor came out. Color was the new exciting thing. Everybody wanted to advertise in color. All of a sudden, you see this black and white ad. You're like, wait, what? They did their job. You stopped. You looked. Advertising worked, right? So sometimes you really need to know, what is everyone else doing? Well, I want to stand out. Let me do something different. That's why it's important to understand the rules, because sometimes you want to follow the rules, but sometimes you may want to break the rules. And it was one of the most effective advertising campaigns of that time. Another legendary campaign, some of you may remember, in 1984, when personal computers came out, Apple computers, there was a video of a very dystopian world. And the big brother was on the screen saying something to a group of identical people who were very monotonously bowing their heads and listening to him. And then all of a sudden you see this speck of color, and it's this woman who runs through the entire space in bright red shorts and throws a giant hammer at the screen and breaks it. And then it says, Apple computers, personal computer, 1984 is not going to be like 1984, you thought, not like Orwell's 1984, right? And the idea was that Apple computers, they're going to change everything. And they really did, because it was the first personal computer, and our world has never been the same since. But if you look at that advertising campaign, the only thing that's moving is the woman. That's the only dynamic thing. And the only thing in color is the woman, right? And so all of this was encoded in the subliminal messages. Remember that I was talking about the red? That's amygdala. Right away, you're like, oh, I'm going to follow her. I'm going to see what she's doing, right? So speaking of red, and that's the last advertising campaign I'm going to talk to you about that was really brilliant and more recent. That's from 2018. So sometimes we know things, we recognize the symbols even if they're not complete. So this is a very famous Follow the Arches ad campaign. Notice that at no point do you see the complete arch of McDonald's. Yet, you immediately know that it's McDonald's. There is no question about it. So what are they doing? They're engaging in play. If you go back in your memory to the first image that I showed with all the colors, another reason that makes us happy is because it's playful. Humans love to play. And in this particular case, advertisers played with people because you would drive down the road and you would see one piece and you say, you just missed us. And then, where's the next one? Oh, it's over there. Oh, next exit, on your left. And so you almost were feeling you were putting a puzzle together. And so you were kind of hunting for these Easter eggs, right? So it was one of the most effective advertising campaigns, and it never showed the full logo, not even once, right? And it's because it's a conversation. Visual language, just like any language, is a conversation between someone who speaks and someone who receives, someone who understands. Well, I want to talk a little bit next is inspiration. Very different category. And for that, I'd like to show you houses of worship around the world, religions that are very different from each other, in times that are very different from each other, in places of the world that are very different from each other. They didn't know each other, they didn't connect with each other. Yet, they created things that are remarkably similar. So, this is Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Okay. It started as a Christian Orthodox cathedral in 537 AD. Then it became a mosque in the 15th century. Then it became a museum in 1934. And then it became a mosque again in 2020. Now, the common thing about a cathedral, a mosque, and a museum, that they're all meant to inspire. They're all meant to elevate our spirits. And so what's amazing about this building is that if we go back to the fundamental building blocks of visual storytelling, you will see that we have levity. Our eye is guided up because the bottom of the building is dark, the top is golden, and there is a multitude of windows where light can stream through. And it elevates our spirits because we look up and we feel joy. This is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, a legendary building that was designed by the famous architect Gaudí. Started building it in 1882. You can see question mark after 2026 is we don't know if it's going to be completed then. They've been trying to complete it forever. It's still not completed because it's extremely complex, as you can see. But just like in Hagia Sophia, multitude of colors up top, golden tones, levity, bright light, and a multitude of these colorful specks of light coming through the window. A sense of awe. It inspires us. We can't believe it's real. It's so high up. This is an image of Jerusalem Synagogue in Prague, very different place that was built in 1906. Look how many different colors and shapes there are on that facade. Our eye keeps darting around, finding different shapes, learning different ideas, and we can't feel but experience joy walking by this building. And then this is Wat Plai Lam Buddhist temple in Thailand, and it was built in 2004. Talking about Buddhism, very different from the previous religions that we discussed. But again, if you look at it, we have a multitude of hands. Each hand is holding something colorful, golden, bright, and they're very high up, right? And so again, our gaze is guided upwards. We're engaged with a multitude of colorful shapes, and we experience awe of something bigger than us, something tremendously beautiful and exciting. And so it's interesting that these fundamental building blocks are encoded in all of us because, of course, people in Hagia Sophia and in Prague and Barcelona and in all these places, they couldn't have met each other, they didn't know each other. But when we build houses of worship, we use this universal language to inspire people who go there. So now I want to talk to you about kind of the next layer of visual storytelling, something a bit more complex that could be more local, more culture specific, and it's kind of the next part of the spiral. It's visual metaphor, scale, and texture. So we use shape as a symbol, visual symbol. So what symbol do you see here when you see this? A house, right? Now, if you really think about it, of course it's not a house, right? We all know it's not a house. It's just a few pieces of wood in a rectangle and a triangle, yet there was zero hesitation in the room. Everybody said a house right away. So how interesting is that, right? Nobody said It's a few pieces of wood connected together by nails and in the shape of it. Nobody said that, right? Even though that's what it really is. But it's a house. And so there are these pictograms, there are these symbols that are universal to the vast majority, I'm saying vast majority of the world, because of course there are indigenous communities that don't build like this, and for them they wouldn't know what this is. But for the vast majority of the world, this symbol means house. However, it's not as fundamental as color and texture and shape, right? That's why it's in a different category, but symbols are extremely powerful because we all recognize them. Then we can combine unexpected things to provoke thought. Encode symbols in visuals. So this artwork was created by my father, Arkady Tzykun. He's a painter and a world-renowned caricaturist. And he called this work Optimist and Pessimist. And right away, when you look at it, you see that what he did is he used something that is commonly used in caricature, is to combine things that are not usually combined together. Sometimes it's to make us laugh, sometimes it's to make us think. And in this particular case, it's of course both. But on the left, you see a person who is very happy, even though he has a very heavy burden tied to him. And on the right, you see a person who is very sad, even though all he has is the balloon. Right? And so the commentary here is that our state is inside us. We are in control of our mood. We are in control of how we feel about things. The circumstances can be whatever we are, but we choose how we react to the circumstances, right? The power is within us, and that's encoded in this one seemingly simple image. Sometimes we show abstract and poetic things to dive into the subconscious. This is a film that I designed that's called Epiphany, Epiphany 5, and it's about this transition between life and death. This moment where you're neither here nor there, the journey. And so as a visual to that, I wanted to place a woman on a hospital bed, but she's floating on the lake, and she's reflecting in the lake, and you don't quite know what is the reflection, what is the reality. She's in that space that are neither here nor there. Can it be flipped? Can it not? And so again, it's this complex visual that is abstract and poetic, but when you see it in the context of a movie, you really start thinking about this very interesting space that is dual. It's the duality of existence. For that brief second, it's a duality of existence that you may be in both places at once. Sometimes symbols can be used to create visual concepts to draw attention. That is also in advertising, but it's also to advertise, in this particular case, cultural events and shows. I'm also a graphic designer, so these are some posters that I created. On the right, you can see it was for a music festival in Norway. That music festival was taking place in the winter. And so I used the symbol of lava, and that the music note is going into the cold rock, and warm lava is coming out of the rock. So juxtaposing warmth and cold and hard shapes with flowing round shapes, making people sense that if they come to the music festival, they will feel inspired, they will feel warm, they will feel excited. And on the left, that's a poster that I created for a production of Faust. Many of you know that story where a person sells their soul to the devil. In this particular production, the devil was commerce, capitalism. And so to encode that idea, you can see that I inserted the word Faust in the barcode on the bottom. So we all know that everything we buy in the supermarket has this barcode with numbers, very recognizable visual. And so you can see on the bottom that hidden inside, barely seen, you can see Faust inside that barcode, and he sold his soul. It's a transactional thing. So I wanted to use this symbol of selling. What do? They scan the barcode to show that he sold his soul to the devil. And here you can see a person screaming, and the barcode is going up the neck, threatening to consume him entirely, right? And the poster needs to encapsulate the production, right? When you pass on the street and you see a poster for a show, you want to know what it's about. So when you're designing a poster for the show, it's very important to get an essence of it from the creators in one sentence and see how can you translate it visually in one sentence. So another element is scale. We talk with scale all the time. So a funny anecdote, does anybody know where lawns come from? Where did this idea even come from? You know, we all have green lawns. So, well, green lawns came from Louis XIV, from the Palace of Versailles. Before that, lawns existed, but you know, animals grazed on these lawns, right? You always had sheep, they grazed on the grass. Well, Louis XIV, when he built Versailles, he wanted to flaunt his wealth. He said, you know what, I have so much money, then I could put all this green grass here and no one is going to be grazing on that grass. It's just for beauty. And people were shocked because you never just had grass with no use, right? So in this particular case, Louis XIV used scale to just show I can do that much grass with no animals, right? And so, of course, his courtiers also wanted to show wealth. Well, they couldn't do quite as much grass, but they could do this much grass. And then the bourgeoisie could do this much grass, but they still wanted to show that they have a little bit that they don't need to graze animals on. So that's where this whole idea of putting green grass in front of your house for everybody to see came from. It is practiced until today. Many people have green lawns in front of their house. Even if it's a tiny little bitty thing in front of your garage, people still have it. Because subliminally, it's kind of encoded that they want to show that, well, we have this land. We don't need to do anything with this land. We have this spare money. We have this, so scale, it's interesting where it came from and how it's being scaled back in modern times. But even today, if we drive by someone's estate and they have a really giant lawn, in our mind, we know, oh, that person is so wealthy, they don't need to put anything there. That's just for show. So I use scale to tell a different story. This was a show I designed at Bard Summerscape Festival in New York. It's an opera called Euryanthe, and it's all about jealousy and betrayal and societal norms. And so I wanted to portray societal norms that were all boxed in, that we're supposed to behave like this and not like that, and suppress our natural urges with straight lines. So you can see around the perimeter, there is a giant palace that is hanging in the air, but it is all straight lines. During the show, once the woman in white, she was accused of cheating on her husband, even though it wasn't true. And her husband started to get very jealous, and conflict came between them. She was falsely accused, but the roots of jealousy started to slowly descend on them in the middle of the set, and they were larger than life, and they almost crushed her at the end. And they descended down over 20 minutes as the house raised up, and she was left in this black void because she was ostracized by society, because nobody wanted anything to do with her. And she was just almost crushed by these roots of jealousy that she was under. And so I was juxtaposing straight lines of what society expected her to be with these very tangled, complex natural elements, complex emotions, not beautiful, not sterile, very messy. And that you could see that here on the left. And the last thing that I will talk about in this chapter is texture. And texture can tell a lot to us about a space or about a person. So I designed a show about the Holocaust in Russia a couple of years ago. The show was in Russia, and we originally did it in the Ekaterinburg State Theater, and we were nominated for 4 Golden Mask Awards, and then the show was taken to the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. And I did the costume designs for that production. Thaddeus Strasburger directed it. And I needed to show the Nazi uniforms. Of course, you can see that on the right, that have very flat, clean texture. And then the inmates in the Auschwitz death camp. Now, as all of you know, of course, they all had identical uniforms. So you may think, oh, well, it was all the same texture, except it was not. because, as some of you may know, so many people were sent to concentration camps so quickly, uniforms could not be made fast enough. So they were made in different factories. They were made in different dye baths. These stripes were in different shapes, different shades. Also, because those people, the inmates, did not have access to laundry, the more you were in the camp, the dirtier your uniform became. And so texturing each individual person became of tremendous importance to me, because I didn't want them being seen as a faceless herd of inmates, identical inmates. I needed their humanity to show through. So there were 70 chorus members in this show, and each of their uniforms were painted by hand. We created a story for each of them. And the painters who created those knew this person just came to the camp. This person has been living in these barracks for 2 years. This person is taking care of an older person. This person is working and cleaning the kitchen, etc., etc., etc. Each of their uniforms, even though from afar you could see that they're all wearing striped trousers and striped jackets, they each looked different. Because to me, as a character designer, again, not a costume designer, as a character designer, it was important to me to send their humanity to the audience, and in an absence of the ability to use color or shape, right, because they all had the same color and the same shape, more or less, I had to resort to texture as the meaning of storytelling. And so it's very, very powerful. Of course, textures was used also to say how wealthy you are. So this is a very different show. I designed costume for an opera called Rigoletto at Boston Lyric Opera. And these costumes were Elizabethan. And at that time, of course, the more ornate your costume was, the wealthier you were, the more expensive fabrics you had. You can see there's brocades and velvets, the wealthier you were. And then, of course, the peasants had very simple textures on their clothes. And so in this particular opera, you see that's the Duchess, one of the wealthiest characters in the show. And so we hand embroidered the court that surrounded her, handmade her headpiece, etc., to make her look extremely ornate. So that as soon as she shows up on stage, we immediately understand that she is a very wealthy woman. And that's another opera that I'll show you, that's the last example. I needed to make characters from a children's book come to life. It was an opera that's called Edward Tulane. It's a children's show. And in this show, some characters from a child's book actually appear on stage. And so I made them two-dimensional, very flat. And so you can see in comparison to this texture that is very complex, or this texture here on the right with the inmate who is very complex, these are completely flat, right, and two-dimensional. And that makes us think about something that could have been printed on paper. And so the last thing I want to talk to you about today is very important, and it's that visual language can actually change behavior. So I wanted to show you, this is another series from my father's work, because he's a very skilled painter. He can paint in any style you want. He lives in Israel, he's a Jewish man, and he has been investigating the sources of anti-Semitism for many, many years. And as an illustrator, as a painter, he wanted to understand, what does it take to actually make someone a stereotype? So he actually drew this human here that you can see on the left, who, if we just look at the human on the left, we recognize him as an elderly, pensive gentleman. And then my father wanted to see if he skews just a few lines, just a little bit, what happens? And that's what he drew here on the right. And that's a terrible caricature. That is a terrible stereotype. And that's how Jews were portrayed in Der Stürmer, which was one of the biggest newspaper in Nazi Germany, where caricatures on Jewish people were constantly shown. And they were meant to dehumanize Jews and to show them as someone who is other, who is not like the people on the left. Someone like other. Here you can see again, on the left, a human being. On the right, some other, some caricature, some stereotype. And so Dad was investigating how many lines do you need to exaggerate. Now that you see them side by side, you could see where it originated. But if you were to look just the caricature, it's a terrible thing. And again. So, things like that, it's what led to Kristallnacht. It's because people saw these caricatures again and again and again with all the propaganda, and they stopped feeling the Jewish people are also people. They thought they're different. They thought they're horrible. And so they thought that they can just eliminate them. They shouldn't live among them. That's what led to Kristallnacht. That happened in 1938. When mobs broke into synagogues and vandalized and burned everything. So visuals can actually affect behavior. And as we know, 6 million Jews were later murdered during the Holocaust. So how we use these images, how much we skew the lines, how much we change these lines, really, really matters. Of course, propaganda can also be used for good, for positive propaganda, right? So we know when COVID-19 just happened, we tried to convince people to stay indoors, to understand what is happening, what is this new virus. And this artist, Dash Dixon, created positive propaganda posters that are based on World War II posters that were very effective. And so you can see it's the style of World War II, but it actually is meant to convince us to stay inside and to keep our distance. Again, there can be negative propaganda, but there can be also very effective positive propaganda. And so, to change behavior, we were talking about drab interiors before, remember? So there is this incredible group that's called Public Color. It's an organization that works on revitalizing struggling inner city schools, and they do it through color. And they actually take schools that are very drab, and they engage students, and they paint them in vibrant colors. And the amazing statistics, if you go on their website, you can just type in Public Color, and you will see retentions of students in school went up. How many people continued to college went up. How many people finished college went up. And it's just because they were in a brighter, more engaging environment where they actually wanted to be, where they didn't feel depressed, when they didn't feel ostracized. They were actually joyful when they came to school. Same thing about our working environments. So on the left, on the right top corner there, you can see a typical cubicle, right? That is easy to clean maybe, but it's very boring. It doesn't make us feel creative at all. Well, these colorful images are of Google offices, one of the most innovative companies of our day. So it's not only colorful, but if you notice, it's very open, right? It has curved offices. It makes people bump into each other and talk to each other and open conversations and not be siloed, right? It makes them be inspired, and it's full of light. It makes them awake, and it promotes creativity. As you can see, Google is one of the leading companies of today. And then the last thing that I'll leave you with really, it's the Reversible Destiny Lofts in Tokyo. And it's an amazing building that invites people to come there and move around in such a way that engages all of your senses, right? So you don't just sit or stand, but you can see the floor is a little bit irregular. The levels of sitting are different. Everything is circular. You have to kind of move in circular ways. There is a swing in there. There is so many different colors. It engages all of your senses, right? So if they call it the Reversible Destiny Lofts because these interiors make us more joyful, more energetic, and more alive. It makes us keep our balance better. It keeps us very happy and very vital, right? So instead of kind of dwindling, we rise. But, I understand that bright color is not for everybody. We covered a lot today. Sometimes you just need to look at the ocean. I highly recommend that as a cleansing palette, and if you have a beautiful beach here. But I'll leave you with this. So, as you can see, that carefully created visuals are really often a double-edged sword. That's what I really tried to communicate today in this talk, and they're capable of being used for both benevolent and malevolent purposes. They have potential to unite or divide us. They have potential to enlighten or mislead, and to motivate individuals and societies to undertake monumental endeavors that can really alter the course of history for the bad or for the better. And my real hope is understanding the weight that visual communications can carry will really inspire people to treat this powerful tool with great care. Thank you. I'll leave this. Thank you so much. Thank you. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer. I'll leave you with this slide, just as a visual meditation after all the visuals that I showed. But if anybody has a question, I'll be happy to try to answer. No promises. Yes. Hold on 1 second. We'll bring a microphone to you, and I'll repeat your question for the live stream.
I was just interested in how fashion plays into what you were talking about, or how people use the storytelling in fashion.
Yeah, so the question is how people use the storytelling of fashion. This is a very layered thing, and it's very culture dependent, right? So fashion is very different in every culture, so the answer will be different for every culture. What I do say that is common to everybody, that people do have a reaction to what you look like, everywhere, right? And we do read a person from the way they look, even before they start speaking. And so how you present yourself is important, because you need to understand that however you are dressed, whenever you're going to go into the world, people are going to read you as such. So it just has to be intentional, right? If you want to blend into the environment, probably would wear subdued colors and very general forms. If you want to stand out, it would probably be bright colors, bright patterns, unusual forms, and that will work just because it's very fundamental. The more subtle cues, subtle things would be very culture dependent. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
On that poster that had the Faust,
Yeah.
and the scan, the barcode, there were numbers in between.
Yes.
Did the numbers mean anything?
No, the numbers didn't mean anything because I didn't want to distract from the word. I really wanted people to read the word, so I specifically wanted the numbers to just be nonsense. Yeah, because it's very, actually, thank you for asking that. It's very important where you want to draw the eye of the person in your visual storytelling. If your image is very, very busy, people will not know where to look. And as communicators, we're responsible for the attention of people who give us their attention. And so we need to be conscientious of that and guide their eye, whether it's on a 2D image or it's on stage. We need to guide their eye, because if everything is happening everywhere all at once and everything is interesting, we get lost, right? So if the numbers meant something and the letters meant something and the image meant something and, if you walk by it, you don't know where to look. And so choosing what you really highlight and what you let go, it's part of the craft.
I just have one other question, Vita, and that has been so interesting to me to hear your personal story. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you would share a little bit about that.
Well, the personal story as it relates to this, so the question was about my personal story. As it relates to this is that I grew up and lived in 3 very different countries and cultures. So I was born and raised in Soviet Union, in Ukraine. And so I was raised under a totalitarian regime, brainwashed with totalitarian imagery. So we lived in the center of Odessa on the Black Sea, and we lived in the very center of town. And across the street from us was the Philharmonic, and it had really giant windows, beautiful windows. But for the 1st of May, they were covered with huge posters of Lenin, Marx, and Engels. And that was my visual out of the window for my childhood, for year after year. And every classroom had a poster of Lenin. And it says that Lenin lived, Lenin lives, and Lenin will always live. And as a child, I really believed that. So when we had to write an essay, how we spent our summer, my essay was that I was inviting Grandpa Lenin to come and swim with me in the Black Sea in Odessa and visit Ukraine, completely not understanding that he's been long dead. So, the brainwashing works, and I know it as someone who has been under it. I truly believed it. I truly believed it. In 1990, my family fled the USSR, and we were refugees. We went to Israel. My family still lives in Israel. And I found myself in a completely different environment in the Middle East, where everything was absolutely different. The architecture, the language, the climate, the customs, so Ukraine is in Eastern Europe, as you know. Odessa is a very European city. The center of Odessa, it looks like Paris, like Milan. It's these beautiful Baroque buildings that were built in the 18th and 19th century. We lived 15 minutes from a gorgeous ornate opera house. And then when we arrived to Israel, there were all these Bauhaus, very simple Bauhaus buildings. And I could not for the life of me remember where we lived because every building looked the same. And I eventually realized that there is a very tall palm tree next to our building. And because I couldn't read Hebrew yet, I couldn't read the street signs, I was looking for the tall palm tree to figure out how to go home because I couldn't tell this building from this building. And so I needed to learn a completely different visual language and a completely different cultural language. And because I didn't speak Hebrew, I needed to learn how to read people from their body language and their clothing because I couldn't understand what they're saying for quite a long time. And then I came to the United States to do my master's degree in design in New York University. And even though I spoke English quite well by the time I came here, the customs here, the culture here, again, is quite different from the Middle East or Soviet Union, Ukraine. And so I've been very lucky to live in 3 very different cultures and systems of visual storytelling. And I think that enables me to be more attuned to that, how different people interpreted different things around the world. And so when I design, I always think about, okay, who is my audience? Am I doing it for someone very local, and then I can speak to them on a very granular, more complicated level, like what we talked about? Or am I doing it for a global audience, where people are going to have very different cultures and notions, and then I have to simplify? I have to simplify my visual language to make sure that what I want to say actually goes to all of these very, very different brains, because everybody has very different frames of reference. So, yeah.
So could you speak briefly about what is the cost of good design compared to, let's say, not so interesting design or status quo design in terms of, like if you were to talk to people who work in business and are responsible for making design decisions about structures that are being built or products that are being produced, what is the difference in cost for something that implements a lot of these ideas that you're talking about versus something that is just kind of what everyone else is doing?
Yeah, so the question is, what is the cost of good design versus bad design in business, for example, right? And what is the cost of that? Am I understanding it correctly? Yeah, and so, I would say that the cost of producing it is the same. The cost of producing good design or bad design is the same cost, but the cost on the other side greatly differs, right? Because if you present bad design, just let's say poorly done design, that means that people just won't understand it and won't engage in it, right? So if you are a business owner and you want to advertise and you just create bad design, well, you just lost your money, right? You invested all that money in bad design and nobody can understand it. Good design does engage and can bring you money tenfold. Also, intention. If you put terrible intention in your design and it's effective, then, it can lead to horrible, horrible actions. I mean, we know that some of the best design, unfortunately, is done in totalitarian regimes. I mean, think about these Nazi uniforms. They were designed by Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss. Yes. Beautiful. If I were to look at Nazi uniforms just purely as a costume designer, flawless. If you look at graphic design of any totalitarian regime, stunning. And that's why so many people responded to it, you see, because it was so good. So many people got convinced. And so people who want to communicate benevolent ideas really need to learn from the good design for the horrible ideas and do better than that. They need to do better than that. That's why whenever I teach my students, I always show the totalitarian design and say, study that and do better, right? Because we need to know what affects us and how it affects us and be better than the ones who wanted to go for malevolent purposes, right? And so the cost can actually be real world, real human life, real environment, right? The cost can be huge. So, yes, thank you for that question. Great.
Thank you. This question may be a little personal, but it's a follow-up on Sister Monica's question. You're an amazing and astounding woman. I'm so grateful to hear your talk and your being here.
Thank you.
And the reason this is a little personal is because as a costume designer, and as you call it, character designer, how does the way Vita dresses wonderful now say about, what do you want to say about your character?
Oh, okay, so the question was, thank you for that. The question was because I'm a character designer, how do I dress myself? And what do I want to say with this garment? That is a very good question. Well, so I had two purposes with this garment. Is because I knew I'm going to be standing in front of a black and white background, and I wanted to make sure to still harmonize with it, but stand out from it. So that's why I'm wearing black. So I'm still in the general color scheme, but I'm not wearing white, I'm wearing gray, because I knew that if I stand here, or if I stand here, the cameras will be able to pick me out, right? The reason that it looks so different is because I wanted you to see that I'm talking about visual communications and draw your attention to me, and that's why I'm wearing this very interesting thing. It's actually made of wire, so I can sculpt it as I go. I can change it. I can change it right now. Yeah. So it's a very theatrical cape. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.